welcome to this part 4 of the circle dynamics physiology. Where we've come from is starting with number 2, yin yang, and looking at heaven and earth and the way these great motions of yang and yin create life, create the person. And then we moved on to look at how those motions create the wuxing, which are the birth, the growth, maturation, decline, and completion. We looked a little bit about the difference between 5 and 6 and what the wuxing are, and a little bit about the qi that the Liu Jing bring in to create life. So in this class, we're going to be looking in a lot more detail at the Liu Jing and seeing how they are great sweeping motions and what their purpose is, how they support us, and ultimately we'll be able to look at how to tell diagnostically which of these great sweeping motions we've lost alignment with, and how the formulas of Zhang Jing are designed to restore the proper functioning of the Liu Jing. So we're continuing on with physiology before we go into pathology and diagnosis. So I'm going to share my screen and move right into our class for today. And I hope that you feel open to asking any questions in the forums that are associated with these lectures. Okay, so circle physiology, the great sweeping motions. I'm going to start just to kind of review through the writings of this author who wrote the Yihui Yicong Yuanyao, the Yihui Yuanyao, and he's from 1812, and his name is Cai Yiji. So he asks, how is it that humans are born? They are born from fire. Humans are born in the fire earthly branch, yin. Fire is yang's substance. Mother Nature applies yang as the root of birth, and human's fire is Mingmen. Ruist scholars say that the heavenly gate is in Zi. Physicians say that humans are born from water, and the kidneys are the source of water. Who has the knowledge that Zi is the beginning of yang, and that the kidneys are fire's vault? So just for those of you, the Zi has to do with the north and the water. And so Cai Yiji is saying that actually, even though this is water and this is related to the kidneys, it's also the beginning of yang. And so if we have that image of yin yang, you can see yang comes down into the kidneys, into water. And so that water is the storage, the vault of that yang. And that yin that is born in the east, that comes up in the east as new life, is born from that yang inside of it. And therefore, water and fire are paired names. It's also true that fire and water are not paired substances. So what does he mean like that? Water is paired with post-heaven fire, and this is the Li trigram. So this Li trigram we can see is 2 yang lines with a yin line in the middle. So there's yang with yin inside of it. And this is a post-heaven trigram, as we'll see, because the pre-heaven trigram for this most yang aspect, this pre-heaven Qian, is this other trigram for fire, Qian, which is pure. It's Qian is pure yang. It's a birth. Yang is the birth of fire and water and is fire source. So we have this pre-heaven Qian, but when you put a drop of water in it, it starts to go down, and that starts to create the post-heaven life. That water is what makes it the beginning of yin, so that yang is actually, it's not left up in heaven separate from earth. It starts to interact. So it's that beginning of fire interacting with water to bring fire some weight, so it starts to come down. So the Qian is pure yang, and yang is the birth of the post-heaven fire and water. The fire of post-heaven has some form, while the fire of pre-heaven has no form. Fire with form is restrained by water, meaning it's in right relationship with it in the post-heaven body. Fire that has no form is that which is brought to life from water. So add a little bit of water, then it's brought to life. So here we have this diagram of heaven up above, big, earth below, big, and the person in the middle. And so we have the Qian trigram, the pure yang, and the Kun trigram below, which is pure yin. And we know if yang is on top and yin is below, that they are not in relationship with each other. And so when they're brought into relationship with each other, we have the Li trigram, which is a post-heaven up above. And that Li trigram has a little bit of water, so it comes down into water. And then we have the Kan trigram, which is a line of fire within water lines. And that is in the east, and that fire that's within the water now can steam up. So water within fire brings the fire down. Fire within water brings that water up. And now fire and water are interacting with each other. And that's post-heaven. That's the right relationship of post-heaven. So if we look at the pre-heaven arrangement from Huxi, we see that the Qian and Kun, the pure yang and pure yin, are above and below. If we look at the post-heaven arrangement, which is also the King Wen arrangement, we see that Li is above and Kan is below. So that's pre-heaven, and here we have the post-heaven, which is the interaction. Always post-heaven is now yin-yang are interacting with each other. So this is just to kind of place us in the whole background of what we're doing to get us to number 6. So here, this black line is the horizon. And we've already looked at this great turning. We can say it's like the sun going around the earth. That's the most obvious cycling of this fire that's coming down and going back up again. And the horizon line here is important because we're going to be looking at the 3 yang as being above the horizon and the 3 yin as being below the horizon. So this great turning is happening. It's in the celestial bodies that are circulating always around us. That's happening in the heavens, and therefore the same turning is happening in me. And this is how the yin-yang interact between heaven and earth and within me. So these Liu Jing, what are they? So these are all things that I think they are. And we'll also look at what I think they're not. But these are all things that I think they are. First of all, they're the 6 channels Jing can be translated as the channels and these pathways, these vertical pathways, like the channels in the body, and also the channels through the body that connect us between heaven and earth. We can also say that they're the 6 conformations. And I like that definition of the Jing, as conformation, and I have some definitions of conformation here. The formation of something by appropriate arrangement of parts or elements and assembling into a whole, or correspondence to a model or a plan or a structure. And then we'll also call them the great sweeping motions, which is, as I've said, my own term for them. Hopefully through this class, you'll see why I will consider them to be great sweeping motions. So what they're not, in my opinion, are 6 stages or 6 levels. These 6 stages, it's, in a way, it's not that these Liu Jing don't go through their own circulation and go from one to another constantly. And so there's a way we could see them as stages. But generally, when they are referred to as stages, it's just about a cold evil coming in from the outside, cold or cold wind, and that the first level is the first stage. And that's Taiyang, where you've had an attack of cold or of wind or of wind cold on the exterior. And that as this progresses, it goes deeper and deeper and deeper into the interior of the body. And so all of these are the initial causative factor is this attack of wind and cold on the outside of the body. And for me, this is just actually completely wrong. It's not anything like what Zhang Zhenjing probably had in mind. This is also kind of an example of linear thinking, like it's going in a line from the outside inside deeper and deeper without any sense of the circular dynamics that are really like over and over and over. The whole Huangdi Neijing is about circular dynamics and how much in modern times we've moved away from circular dynamics and not only become more linear, but we've also developed a sense of the inside of me being vulnerable to the outside, and the outside being something that I have to protect myself from, because the outside is going to attack me. It's kind of dangerous, and so I have to protect myself. I exist on the inside, and all these pathogens exist on the outside that I need to protect myself from. So what we'll be looking at as an alternative way of thinking about it is not that the outside is something that I need to protect myself from, but the outside is constantly coming into me, and that's how I live. That is the source of my well-being, is by being permeable and having the outside move through me. And that our goal as human beings and our goal as practitioners is to be aligned with and in right relationship with the outside so that we can be healthy. So the outside is very necessary for my internal health. Outside and the inside are constantly interacting with each other. So both the linear as well as this sort of development of things outside are dangerous. I have to protect myself. I'm on the inside. We're going to challenge both of these ideas about physiology. Okay, so the 6 conformations allow us to bring in the motions and qualities from heaven and earth so as to generate birth, growth, development, maturation, storage, which we also define as completion or death. So we bring in the qualities from heaven and earth, which are the 6 chi, so as to live. We bring those in so as to live. And so those are constantly being brought in order to generate the wuxing, which are wood, birth, fire, growth, earth, maturation, metal, decline, water, completion. We keep going back to yin yang. So this is some writing from this book here on the dawning formulas, the 2 dawning formulas and the 4 spirit formulas from the Fuxing Shui. And this is this guy, Yizhi Biao, who is expressing the teachings of his master, Zhang Dachang, about the Fuxing Shui. Beautiful, beautiful writing. I'm just so excited to be working on these books. So he shares, heaven is above and is yang, earth is below and is yin. The yin yang of heaven and earth exchange and touch, rotating and transforming, and giving birth to the changing climates of the 4 seasons. When the transformations of the 4 seasons manifest in form, they are the regular patterns of birth, growth, transformation, gathering, and storage. This kind of regular pattern is the way and principle of nature. Human beings realized and mastered the way and principles of these natural patterns, following their movements. This has benefited the lives, survival, and peace of thousands of human beings. This is a perpetual truth. The Tao Te Ching chapter 16 says, to know eternity, that which is perpetual, is enlightenment. Not knowing eternity, and instead being attached to that which is born and dies, is to act rashly and will meet with disaster. So this eternity is that everything is constantly being born and passing away. It's kind of the law of impermanence, and being comfortable with that is enlightenment. So these motions that go on forever. And so it's really kind of, he's asking a question like, what do we want to be identified with? That which is born and dies, including myself, or with eternity? Okay, so we have this horizon line here. And the yang conformations are the motions that are above the horizon. So Taiyang, Yangming, Shaoyang are all the yang conformations. They all have the name yang in them. And we know that the yang conformations are associated with fu organs. When we think about fu organs, we see that those organs are hollow organs. And that means that they're hollow like a tube is hollow. And so in order to be healthy, the yang conformations must be open through, right? Like all those hollow things must open through. That pathology of the fu organs is always about them not being open through, them being blocked in some way. So this is a generalization about the yang conformations, that in general, they all need to be open through. So we need to make sure that the pathways are open with the yang conformations, and that when they aren't, that's the pathology of the yang conformations. So this is really just a basic idea about yang and yin, and the zang and the fu. So those yang conformations above need to be open through in order for yin yang to continue to constantly move into the right relationship of our organized human system. On the contrary, the yin conformations are below the horizon, Taiyin, Shaoyin, Jueyin. They all have the word yin in them. And they're associated with zang. And zang means to store. So we can generalize about the yin conformations that they all need to be able to store. And what is it that they store? They store yin and yang, basically. They're going to store yin and yang. So at not being open through, instead they have to be closed. They have to store. So we can divide the 3 yang and the 3 yin that way, that the 3 yang must be open through, the 3 yin must store. There are some exceptions to this, but this is the general way we want to think about the conformations. So if we think about this movement and now it's going below the horizon, you know, what happens in the winter? We gather, we store, and we don't come back out until the right time. And that is the yin conformations doing that. So yang is stored, yang comes back out. Yang is stored, yang comes back out. So the order that we're going to go in looking at each of the conformations is according to the organization of the Shanghanlun, which is starting with Taiyang, going to Yangming, Shaoyang, the 3 yang conformations, then going to Taiyin, Shaoyin, Jueyin. So we'll start with Taiyang. And what does Taiyang mean? Because it's more than just a conformation. Taiyang actually means the sun or sunlight. And let's look at the character for Tai. It is the character for big, which is da, with that little line. And Tai means like the maximum or the extreme, the extreme yang, the maximum yang. And this is in contrast with xiao, which is the character for small with a small line. And the xiao means like the lesser yang or a young yang. And I love that. It's a young yang. It's yang that hasn't come out and done its full thing yet. The full thing is the taiyang or the taiyin. And so then also taiyang also means the sun or sunlight. So in Suen chapter 3, it says, the movements in heaven require the sun to be lustrous and bright. Hence yang follows and rises. It is that which protects the outside. And from dawn to noon, this is the yang of heaven. It is the yang within yang. Now, I want to go back in time a little bit because I really grew up along with most people in the world of Chinese medicine with this linear idea about the 6 levels or 6 stages. And I remember kind of the moment that it dawned on me, and here we're talking about dawn, that it dawned on me that the structure of the Shanghanlun was about circular dynamics. And I really all of a sudden could see, oh, Taiyang. Taiyang is about the yang in my body coming up and out to its extreme, to its maximum. That's the nature of Taiyang. and that's the Taiyang great sweeping motion. And so that's what we're looking at, is this motion from the depths coming up and out to the maximum as Taiyang. And when I realize this, and we'll see how that relates to the other conformations, but all of a sudden also the formulas made so much sense to me. And we'll see this as we go along. So we'll look at this dawn character. From the point of view of the character dawn, which is pronounced dan, the upper part is the sun character, and this represents the sun, Taiyang. The lower part expresses the Earth's horizon. Therefore, the fundamental meaning of dawn is the sun rising from the Earth's horizon. It is the morning time when the sun is just rising. Therefore, yang dawn is the morning of the summer solstice, when the sun shines on Earth most strongly. It's when the sun is at gun Earth time, and I put a picture of the these hexagrams so we can see that that's over in the east. At the very beginning of the east going up is the gun Earth time. So the image is that of rising to leave the Earth's surface. Now, this is the writing again of Yi Biao on behalf of Zhang Dacheng. And what's interesting is that it's from this book that's talking about the two dawning formulas. There's actually 4 dawning formulas. There's a major and a minor of the yang dawning, and a major and minor of the yin dawning. And so here he's talking about the yang dawning, which is the sun coming up, the Taiyang coming up. And the formula for the dawning of yang is the minor yang dawning formula is Guizhitong, which is a formula that helps yang go up and out. That's the Xiaoyang Dantong, is Guizhitong. So we see that we could just get a little bit of an idea of the Taiyang. What is it we're trying to do with the Taiyang when we restore the function? We're restoring the function of yang going up and out to the surface of the body. So there's the yang going down and then up to the surface of the body from gun. Okay, so looking at Taiyang, it starts in the north, and the qi of Taiyang is cold, and cold is associated with the north. So when we say that Taiyang is the cold water of the north, it's because that's where the Taiyang, the root of Taiyang is. That's where it starts. The north generates cold, which generates water, the water phase. And cold is the qi of Taiyang. The water phase is in the north, but cold, Taiyang, is the great sweeping motion from the north all the way to the south. So this is the motion of Taiyang from the north, from the cold water of the north to the south. It is the motion of Taiyang. Cold is that which hibernates and stores the life force fire. Taiyang is transformed cold water, and it's transformed by the fire that's inside of it. And we'll see that fire gets inside of it by the great sweeping motion of Shao In. That's how the fire comes down and in. And so the motion of Taiyang is with that fire inside of it. It creates a steam that goes all the way up from the north to the south. through the east. It does it through the east because the east, we know when we face south, the east has to do with all rising motion. So here's rising motion. So it's associated with the east, where the west is always descending motion. So it's fire within water that drives Taiyang upward. Upward is the motion of the east, and hence Taiyang is in the east. So that's the great sweeping motion of Taiyang. That's the motion of the Taiyang conformation. So over there, we watch the fire, and the fire goes up and out in the east. It's inside the yin, and then it goes up and out in the east. Okay, so the next conformation we're going to look at is the Yang Ming. So we have from the Neijing that the West generates dryness, which generates metal. So again, we have this repeated all the time. The direction generates the qi. And as this gets more and more into form, it generates the metal phase. And so dryness is the qi of Yang Ming. So the Yang Ming great sweeping motion is what brings dryness into the body, just as the Taiyang is bringing cold into the body. The metal is in the west, but dryness, Yang Ming, is the great sweeping motion from the south to the north. So just like we did with Taiyang, we're saying the water element is in the north, and that is fixed. That's related to the north, and it's related to completion, and it's still, as we saw in our previous classes. So we can say where the water element is, it's in the north, but we can't say that a conformation is in a particular direction because they are motions. We can say where they start and where they reach completion, but we can't say where they are. So Taiyang is north to south, Yang Ming is in the west, so it's a downward motion from the south through the west toward the north. So it's that movement in the west from south to north. So there's the movement of Yang Ming going down. And dryness wants to dissipate. So it generates this pungent flavor that's associated with the west. And that's kind of, so things can be broken apart like a fruit that's rotting and falling away. So life can decline and move towards winter. So watching the fire goes down in the west, goes down in the west. That's Yang Ming. So let's look a little bit more about, that should say Yang Ming, not timing. So Yi Zhibiao says about this definition of Ming. In addition to meaning bright and shiny, Ming also means to know the principles of nature. Only then will you understand. Ming Bai is to understand. You'll only then will you have clarity about the Tao. This is the more profound layer of the meaning of Ming. It's common for people to say, so-and-so is very perceptive, a very perceptive person, a very Ming Bai person. How would we understand saying, so-and-so is a bright, shiny person? This kind of person that we say is very Ming Bai, very kind of bright and shiny, which really means very perceptive, possesses a remarkable, outstanding Ming. Ming character has the sun and the moon together hanging in the sky, which are the natural sources of illumination. Their mutual alternating rotations are the original root of the seasonal changes between winter and summer. They are the celestial phenomena of brightness, the great sun and moon, emperor and empress. So we have this yang brightness. The sun and moon hang in the sky, illuminating this great earth. They are the source of illumination of the natural world. The word Ming is formed with the sun on the left and the moon on the right. In the Zhou Yi title chapter, it says Yi. This is the Yi from the I Ching. This has the sun above and the moon below, is heaven and earth. Through it, one can know the Tao of heaven and earth. Therefore, on the oracle bones, the word Yi has the sun on top and the moon below. So we can see this character Ming and Yi are very similar. Sun above or the sun to the left. One could say that Ming leads to Yi. Knowing illumination leads to change, and change leads to knowing illumination. Illumination and change are interlinked, communicating with each other. Change and illumination generate each other. So this is just to go a little more deeply into this character Ming. And the reason why I want to go into it like this is because Yang Ming is actually the confirmation that brings in yang illumination into our bodies that leads to changes in our bodies. So we'll see the great sweeping motion from the south to the north. What's in the south is heaven and the brightness of the sun, and that yang is being brought into our bodies, and the pathway for that yang being brought into our bodies is the yang Ming. And so that's not only the yang warmth of our body, in our body, but also the spiritual illumination that's coming in, the spiritual intelligence that knows how to run our bodies is coming in through that pathway. So we don't want to just think of it as yang Ming, oh, it's related to the stomach and large intestine. We also want to think it's this incredibly important pathway for bringing in yang and influences into our bodies. So it's coming down in the west in order to bring that all the way to the north. Yang brightness. When one faces south, before you is the yang brightness. So there's this sense of the sun being at its zenith, and what brought it there was the Taiyang, and now it's at its zenith. And when it's exactly at its zenith, like in the middle of the day, on the summer solstice, it's straight up there in the sky. What is the next direction it's going to go? And the next direction it's going to go, start to go, is down. You know, so it's middle of the day, high noon. The sun is high up in the sky. Which direction is it starting to travel? Now it's traveling towards the west. That movement towards the west is Yang Ming. And so that's a yin movement. The yin is starting to grow. It's very, very small, but it's starting at that moment. So the yang Ming is the yin within the yang, where we saw Taiyang is yang within yang. Yang Ming is yin within yang, because the movement here is towards the west and towards yin. And that's really important, because when we start to look at pathology and yang Ming pathology, we have all this yang, and it's starting to come into the body, coming on a downward path in the body. And what would happen if at midday on the summer solstice, we said, well, why don't we just stop the sun in the sky? Things would start to get very, very hot and very, very dry, very, very quickly. So what is the pathology of Yang Ming? Well, in my body, if my Yang Ming gets blocked, it starts to get hot and it starts to get dry. So the pathology of Yang Ming is always this Yang getting blocked. So we can say the pathology of Yang Ming isn't that we got a hot pathogen into our body. It's actually my own life force that stopped moving. It stopped moving with nature. Nature keeps on moving, but my body is going too slow. It gets stopped up. So I start to develop heat, and that heat is primarily going to be upstream, so with my upper body. So we get lots of symptoms of red face, agitation, fever from the blockage of my own Yang Ming. So this movement of this bright Yang coming down in the body. And it's very physiological. At the same time, if it gets blocked, it becomes very pathological. And that's Yang Ming. Yang Ming brings in the dryness qi, and it brings this in order to aid life. So it functions to transform all these wet foods and fluids. And actually, these foods are how we get yang into our body. Because all the plants, they've been soaking up sunlight. They're filled with all of this yang, and then we eat them. And so it has yang, it has also these juicy fluids, and Yang Ming steams and dries it. And the damp that's steamed off goes right into the qi of the spleen, which is dampness, the qi of Taiyin. So Yang Ming has that function of drying as the wet, sloppy foods move through. And we're also receiving the yang through the foods that we eat. And so that food, those food and fluids moves down my body like a conveyor belt. So we can see that Yang Ming is also very much related to the vertical downward movement of our digestive system. Really, Yang Ming is all of the hollow food organs. It's really the whole digestive system. So in the opening line of the Yang Ming chapter of the Shanghan Lun, Zhang Zhongjing writes, the stomach is the domain of excess. And here, this word stomach isn't just this little organ above the large intestine there. The word stomach is also a word that connotes the entire vertical digestive tract. And so here it's all of these fu organs. So it's important diagnostically that when we diagnose in number 5, which means diagnosing Zangfu, that we have the large intestine associated with the metal phase, but we have the stomach associated with the earth phase. We have the small intestine associated with the fire phase. We have the gallbladder associated with the wood phase. And we have the bladder associated with the water phase. However, when we get to number 6, all of these fu in this perspective relate to the digestive system, so they all also relate to Yang Ming. So we can say Yang Ming is that whole digestive tract, that whole vertical movement, so that great sweeping motion between heaven and earth coming down and providing dryness, all of that is very much related to the downward movement of the digestive tract. And it's sort of the most obvious vertical movement. It's also related to the vertical movement downward of the menstruation, and also childbirth, any kind of downward vertical motion has a connection to yang ming. So what I meant by it's important diagnostically is that we might have stagnation in the large intestine, say in the form of constipation. And in number 5, we might say there's large intestine stagnation. And that is located in the large intestine, but we don't know yet what is the great sweeping motion that's involved. So constipation could be caused from spleen qi deficiency or from liver blood deficiency, in which case it would not be a yang ming pathology. And if we treat yang ming, and we all know if you purge everyone who has constipation, you're going to cause really big problems in most of your patients. So if you say that the large intestine is the same as yang ming, then you would create lots of problems. So we have to separate out 5 and 6. So the large intestine is in number 5. What is yang ming? Yang ming is the great sweeping motion downward, and it's the domain of excess. So if we see a blockage in downward vertical movement that is pure excess, then we know that it's yang ming. However, if we see blockage in the large intestine or in the stomach, and it's not pure excess, then it's not yang ming. So we look at the organ of the stomach and the organ of the large intestine, and that is not the same as yang ming. Those organs can have pathology, but the pathology of yang ming has to be pure excess for it to be yang ming pathology. And so that just gives a little bit of a hint about the importance of separating 5 and 6. The importance, and really that means the importance of separating the Zangfu diagnosis. The organs are fixed, large intestine stasis, stasis in the stomach. That's in a fixed position in an organ. But what we're training to look at is what's the great sweeping motion behind that stasis? Is it a problem with the yang ming great sweeping motion? Or is it a problem, say, with the Tai-yin great sweeping motion or the Shui-yin great sweeping motion? We don't know yet until we do our whole diagnosis. So this, I think, gives a little bit of an introduction to how important it is to separate out 5 and 6 and to know when am I talking in number 5, and here I'm associating number 5 with Zangfu diagnosis. When am I talking about Zangfu diagnosis, and when am I talking about the great sweeping motion? And as we go through this, we'll look at how do we go from seeing what's going on, both from signs and symptoms, but also from knowing their spleen qi deficiency or knowing their stasis in the large intestine. How do we go from that diagnostic knowledge to seeing the great sweeping motion that's behind it? If we don't separate those things out, you'll be purging a lot of people who Zhang Zhongjing says very clearly in the opening line of Tai-yin, if in these kinds of cases of stasis in the digestion, you purge, you'll cause all kinds of problems. Right away he says that. And he says that because it would be so easy to think, I need to purge because there's all this stuckness in the digestion. So I hope that that's clear. So in our physiology here, in the very beginning of it, we said, how do we tease apart Wuxing from Liu Jing, this number 5 from number 6, and not just mix them all together? Well, there's some stasis in the large intestine, and that means yang ming. That's what happens a lot. And that's what causes a lot of problems, is that mushing together of Zangfu, which I'm calling number 5, because each of those Zong and Fu are related to a phase of the Wuxing. When we mix that up with the invisible realm of the great sweeping motions, on the other hand, if we just treat in number 5, which most of us were trained to do, to have a Zongfu diagnosis, if we just treat that, then we really miss restoring the great turning, restoring the healthy motion within our patients. And it's much more limited, our treatment. I'm just going to supplement the spleen qi, but not seeing what's the great sweeping motion behind that, we won't have nearly as good results. So for the sake of, seeing more than just the Zongfu into the great sweeping motions, but also in the service of not mixing up Zongfu with these confirmations, with these great sweeping motions. That's what we're trying to do. So now we're looking at what is Yangming. It's this downward motion from the south to the north that's bringing in yang. It's the pathway of yang. And it depends on all the vertical motion in the body. The grossest form of that is our digestive system. So here on the right, you see a hollow tube, and that's kind of representing the hollow vertical movement of the digestate and the yang from heaven. It's moving downward, vertically downward into our bodies. And it's going through the various fu organs. And it's we have the sanjiao at the bottom because that's the ministerial fire that's sort of activating all of this. But it's bringing in all this digestate, all of our food and fluids that's going through these different organs on its way down. So what I want to point out here is that all of this transformation in the digestive system is through the fire that we'll look at that fire more when we get to Shaoyang, but that fire that's coming in, and when it changes direction, it becomes this upward movement of fire that becomes the ministerial fire. And that acts in these organs, the stomach, the small intestine, large intestine, bladder, in order to transform. So it's through the action of fire that this drying happens and all this transformation happens. And these different fu organs that are part of this vertical movement do different things on their way down. The stomach rots and ripens, so that warmth is being used to rot and ripen, to transform. In the small intestine, that fire transforms in order for the abundance, the nourishment, the minute essences to be absorbed into my body. The large intestine uses that fire in order to absorb moisture. And the bladder steams that moisture upward and also helps to separate so that the unneeded moisture can leave the body. So one way that I look at this is that the spleen, and here we'll do this next. This is meant to be like a sponge. So we can say that the spleen is like this factory, and the food is moving through vertically downward on this conveyor belt, which is Yangming. It's going through each of these stations, the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine, the bladder. All the food and fluids is going through these stations. And we could see the ministerial fire as sort of the fire that's inside each of these workshops So the stomach is using that fire to rot and ripen. The large intestine is using it to dry, and it's going through each of these workshops as it's going through this factory. But all of this is in service of absorbing into, and so there's this sponge like absorbing all of this warm, nourishing moisture into the spleen. So the spleen is sort of this overarching space form that is all of this nourishment and warmth and moisture is being absorbed into. So we can sort of start to see the relationship of the Yang-Ming vertical movement with the Tai-Yin absorptive nature and the relationship of each of these fu organs along this pathway. Okay, so the next one we're going to look at then is Shaoyang. So we have the fire phase is in the south, but the fire movement is doubling, which creates 6, right? And to me, that doubling is really saying fire is moving. Fire is moving. It's the fire that's moving all the time. It's the illumination that's moving all the time. So we have heat is the fire of Shaoyin, and fire is the fire that transforms into light, which is the Shaoyang. Fire is the qi of Shaoyang. And Shaoyang is the great sweeping motion from the west through the north to come up and out in the east. So it's this motion. And we know that Shaoyang is a pivot. And what does it pivot? It pivots, the Yang Ming is bringing in the Yang from heaven, but that Yang doesn't become functional in my body until it changes direction and becomes really that Kan trigram, right? That Yang underneath Yin, that fire, the ministerial fire. The ministerial fire is rooted deep in my body, but it has an upward movement in the body. So how does it change from going down to going up? And, you know, the Neijing says that the imperial fire rules through illumination, and the ministerial fire rules through its position. It has to be in the right position, like being established in the right position. And what does that is the Shaoyang pivot. And the pathology of Shaoyang, as we'll see in our next class, is really about the pivot being blocked and it failing to move the ministerial fire properly into position. So it's a pivotal motion. So often we think of Shaoyang as being related to the spring and the east and this upward movement. However, the only way that ministerial fire can go up and out to be, you know, to be the kidney yang, to be that root fire, is if it gets into the right position. So when we get the ministerial fire into the right position, now it can become the fire of life. Now it can become springtime. If it's not in the right position, then springtime can't happen. And also what happens if it doesn't get into the right position because it's blocked, the pivot is blocked, that fire that should be moving into position to become functional just accumulates and becomes pathological. So we have heat conditions, we have fire conditions from a pivot problem. And we'll see when we get to the pathology in our next class what that might look like, that kind of pivot problem, what it might look like in the body. And the treatment is always going to be, how do I open the pivot so the fire can come into the right position and cease being pathological, but become my life fire instead? So we can see that a Shaoyang problem is not a pathogen in the Shaoyang. The Xiaoyang doesn't even have a location, right? It's a movement. And so instead, it's my life force that's failing to come into position and accumulating and getting hot and harassing me because it's pathological. And the way to resolve that is to open up the pivot to help the ministerial fire come back into the right position. So that's the movement of Xiaoyang, is that pivotal movement. And we could say that pivotal movement is the centrifugal movement going up and out, that turning of the wheel is so life can go up and out. And we'll compare that later to the pivot of Shaoyin, which is so life can come in and be stored. It's centripetal, whereas Xiaoyang is so life can go back up and out. It's that pivotal movement, so life can go up and out. So here we see at the horizon going down, and so it can go up again, down so it can go up. So it starts actually on the horizon in the west, and the pivot turns so that there could be rising of yang. And we'll see that that yang first is going to be rising, like it gets a ministerial fire into position, and the next confirmation is Taiyin. So the very first thing that fire does, it starts to transform food and fluids in earth. So all the yang confirmations need to be open through, as we already discussed, while the yin confirmations need to be able to store. So Shaoyang can be visualized as a pivot or hinge that needs to move freely so the wheel can turn. And here's another image of it. So this pivot is blocked, and so fire accumulates. And that fire is going to show up as particularly Shaoyang type fire. It's not the same kind of heat as Yangming. And we'll look at that when we get to pathology and diagnosis. So when we allow the pivot to open, that fire can now come into position and become physiological fire. So of course we know that the herbs that open the pivot are kind of quintessential herbs are chaihu and hongqin. We have other herbs like mengdancao, shakutao, wugonging that do a similar thing, that have a similar function. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the yin conformations. And again, we look at the yin conformations as below the horizon, and that they store, they absorb and store. And what they're going to absorb and store, we can say in a simple way, is yang and yin. So we'll look at that. So now below the horizon gets into the right position, and now the yang and yin are stored. Okay, so the first confirmation we're going to look at is the Tai Yin. And as a great sweeping motion, the motion of Tai Yin is going to be up and out from the middle. And in the Neijing, it says the center generates damp, which generates soil. Earth is our center, so Earth is in the middle, but Taiyan is that great sweeping motion from the center up to the sky. And actually Taiyin is then raining down. So we have the Earth generating metal, we have the movement from Earth to metal upward into the sky, and just like clouds are steamed up, and then when they reach the limit in the sky where it gets cold, it condenses and turns into rain. So you have steaming up and raining down. So of course it's going to be important when we think about pathology and herbs. The chi of damp is the chi that's actually the like mud. It creates the stabilizing and moistening aspect of life. So here, in terms of the motion of yin yang, it's that yang going up from the center, up and out, and being absorbed in and going up and out from there. And of course, that is with the aid of the ministerial fire. It's kind of like a fire below a cooking pot, creating this steaming up. And then you can imagine the steam going up to the ceiling and condensing into droplets that then rain down. And again, this function of the spleen, the aid of the ministerial fire to be like a sponge to absorb warmth, nourishment, and moisture. And it absorbs it. And remember that it's in the center. And we saw from previous classes how that then can irrigate the four directions, irrigate the other zang. Okay, so the next conformation we're going to look at is Shaoyin. Shaoyin generates heat. So we saw Shaoyang generates fire, and here the south generates heat. So the chi of the south, Shaoyin is heat. And so we have that fire doubled. So the south generates heat, which generates fire, meaning the fire phase. And that heat is the chi of Shaoyin. Fire is in the south. The fire phase is in the south. But Shaoyin is the great sweeping motion that moves from the south through the west toward the north. And you may be thinking, isn't that Yangming? And you would be right. So there are two motions that go from the south through the west toward the north. So here's Shaoyin. So that yang can be stored. Now, if we look at the difference between Shaoyin and Shaoyang, we see that Shaoyin is taking in this vast fire from heaven and condensing it into ministerial fire. And Shaoyin is that great sweeping motion that pivots from heaven into a condensed form inside me. And because Shaoyin is a yin conformation, it's all about the absorption and storage of that yang. And so Shaoyin in pathology would be weak and it would fail to absorb and store that yang. So it has to do with how strong is the function of drawing in and storing the life force. Whereas the Shaoyang has to do with getting that fire into position. So the Shaoyang is in a way similar to Shaoyin in that it has a strong relationship with ministerial fire. However, Shaoyin is how much ministerial fire, how well do I store it? Whereas Shaoyang has to do with, is it getting into the proper position so that it can spread out into the east? So in the same way, you can think about the Yang Ming from the south towards the north, that the Yang Ming is a yang conformation, and its function is about the pathway and the conveyor belt of yang, whereas the Shaoyin is about the strength of the draw and the strength of being able to store it within the Dantian. So heat wants to move downward, so it generates bitter, so fire can mature. Is from the Neijing. So you have that downward motion of fire of the Shaoyin. So it's a centripetal motion of fire from heaven deep into my lower jiao. And then the Shaoyang is a centrifugal movement. So both are pivots. One is centripetal, the other is centrifugal. So having just done Taiyin, you now see like the Shaoyin brings that fire in. So we have that yin yang symbol down in our dantian, where that fire is coming in, and it's the tie-in through the action of the ministerial fire that steams and rains down to create the kidney yin. So as we're moving through these confirmations, we see, oh, this is how fire gets in. And how does water get in? Well, through the action of fire, it gets pulled in from the food coming down the Yangming conveyor belt, being transformed from that fire into dampness that then rains down to become the kidney yin. So now we have the storage by Shaoyin of both yin and yang. So we see that Taiyin is about absorbing moisture and warmth, which is yin and yang, and it's in the form of nourishment. And the Shaoyin is about absorbing yin and yang. And then when they're absorbed and now they're in right relationship, they can interact with each other. And that will move us right into Shuiyin, as we'll see. So east generates wind, and this generates wood. So again, we have the direction generating the qi, which generates the phase. And the great sweeping motion of Shuiyin is now that Shaoyin, yin yang are stored. We have then the yang is going to act on that yin and make it move upward. And the Shuiyin is the blood moving upward in the body. Really, it's related to the venous blood in the body that moves upward in the body. And that blood is warm, it moves up, and it's red. So that yang is within the yin, and when it interacts, it goes into the east. So that's kind of the form. The ministerial fire goes up through Taiyin, but it also goes up through the Shuiyin and the form of blood. And blood is also yang inside the yin. So the Shuiyin, rather than storing through the winter, the Shuiyin starts to come out in the early spring and go up. And that's the wood going all the way up to the heart, or to the pericardium, to what we could call the heart master, the Shinju, through the Shuiyin in the east. So wood is in the east, but the wind of Shuiyin is the great sweeping motion from the north to the south. So again, you might think, well, it wasn't that Taiyang moving from the north to the south, and you would be right. What is the pathway for the Taiyang to move from the north to the south is the Shuiyin. So it's that upward. Yang is in yin and moves upward. So here we have the south, which generates bitter, which generates fire. Fire is in the south, but Shaoyin has the great sweeping motion of the southeast toward the north. And so here I put the picture of the crimson phoenix and the black turtle, the cinnabar bird. that represents the southern direction. And so then below we have the northern direction represented by the black turtle. And so south to north, we have Shaoyin. And from the north to the south, we have Taiyang. So in our next class, when we look at the root, branch, and middle, we'll see that Shaoyin and Taiyang are paired. And it's important to see that this basic function of bringing in life into the ultimate yin and then expressing it back out again with our hearts, that this basic cycle is the Shaoyin paired with the Taiyang. Shaoyin, Taiyang, Shaoyin, Taiyang. This is the basic function of bringing in fire into water and having that fire steam it back up again in order to receive more fire and have that cycle of bringing in life and expressing it back out again with our hearts. Life in, expressing it out. That's Shaoyin, Taiyang, great sweeping motions. Now, Zhuiyin is the east, and that's represented by the blue-green dragon in the east. So we have Taiyang, and it uses the blood as its pathway to reach all the way up to the heart, so that the yang can go all the way back up again. And now in the west, we have the white tiger, and the yang ming is the pathway for yang coming from heaven. Shaoyan is the strength of the draw of yang from heaven into storage. So these two work together, yang ming and Shaoyin. So we can also see this pair of yang ming and Zhuiyin. They're both pathways for the Shaoyin Taiyang to circulate. So the west is represented by the white tiger. And so you can see that we have these formulas like the white tiger decoction or the blue-green dragon. The white tiger decoction has to do with the west and the downward movement of the west. And the blue-green dragon, of course, uses pungent warmth to go up and out. So we start to see this application with the formulas and flavors. And then Shaoyang and Taiyin get the fire into position so that this transformation can become physical. So yang coming in from heaven, and then that ministerial fire cooks in the center to become form, which is the earth form, and the kidney yin that then transforms back out in the east. And so here we have that Shaoyin ministerial fire cooking the stuff that's coming into our digestion in the center to become that life. Now, one thing that I call this part of the cycling, because we can see Shaoyin Yangming down in the west to the north, and then Zhuiyin Taiyang back up and out in the east. And then we have this thing happening in the middle, which is the Shaoyang Taiyin, and I call that the loop-de-loop. So yang comes in, and then it creates the yin in this loop-de-loop so that it can come back up and out into the east. So we have coming in, the loop-de-loop going back out again. So the great sweeping motions of the heavens bring in their respective qi, And this creates birth, growth, decline, death, and rebirth in the body. And these great sweeping motions are the invisible realm, and it's governed by heavenly movements. It generates the hua coming into life and the bien changing, generates birth, growth, maturation, decline, and completion. So there we go. All of the great sweeping motions in one little picture. It's all about bringing in yang from heaven, rooting it, and expression. So it's still, we don't leave number 2, the yin yang, and we don't leave number 3, yin yang in relation to the person. We move to 5, we can see 6. And all the time, it's just a further defining of the basic structure of yin yang. I think it's really beautiful. So just a word about circles and waves. This is a picture of the wave. So if we look at something like the tide, it's pulled by the motion of the moon around the earth primarily. And what I want to point out is that up and down motions are created by circular dynamics. So we see the tides are going up and down, but that's generated by the circular motion of the moon around the earth. So circular dynamics are what cause up and down motions in our body. So other examples of this are like plants that grow up and then die down. We look at the basal body temperature and it's got this wave-like motion going down in the follicular phase and up. So if we graph it, it looks like a wave. However, it's due to circular motions of the rising of yang to ovulation, the decline or the sinking of yang into storage in the what I would call the yin phase, which is usually called the yang phase because the temperature goes up, but really it's the phase where yang is going into yin. And the follicular phase is where yang is coming back out again. We'll go a lot more into this in the women's physiology course at the beginning of the Great Turnings in Women's Lives course that's coming up. Okay, the breath is another up and down motion, the pulse, cranial rhythms, waking and sleeping. Of course, like waking and sleeping is very obvious that we wake when the sun comes up and goes to sleep when it goes down. So it's a very obvious motion. But these other rhythms are also based on cycles from conception to birth. All of these are related to alignment with the circular dynamics of celestial bodies. From the grand birth to death rhythms to the minute rhythms of the pulse, all follow the same principles of yin yang and wuxing and are caused by the circular dynamics of heaven. So now we're going to look a little bit about the Liu Jing in terms of the channels in the body. And for those of you who practice some acupuncture, maybe other forms of acupuncture as well, you can really see the obvious relationship between the qi and the channels. So for example, when you supplement a channel, that it's easy to see doing a psalm treatment that when you treat bladder, when you supplement bladder using that protocol, that someone who's very hot cools down. You know, I remember a patient of mine who was so hot and he had poison ivy all over his body. And it was the dead of summer, you know, just so hot outside. And he was just burning up in every way. And when I did the supplementing bladder treatment, he didn't know anything about what I was doing, but he said, I feel like I have cold water going through my body. And that was because we supplemented the bladder channel. The cold chi of Chaiyang was now able to come into his body. You know, this beneficial cooling came into his body. We can see that the Yang Ming will increase dryness, the Shaoyang will increase the outward motion of Yang, Taiyin increases moisture in the body, Shaoyin increases heat, Jaiyin increases gentle inward movement. You have the Shaoyang, the outward Yang, and the Jaiyin, this gentle inward movement. And of course, this is really a generalization, but it becomes so obvious that when we are diagnosing to see which channel is not functioning properly, and then when we treat that channel, we can see that we're bringing in that chi from heaven into the body, that now that channel is functioning properly so that chi can come in. You know, so the patient that I just mentioned, what was happening was that his bladder channel was not functioning properly, so that he couldn't manage heat in his body because he didn't have a relationship with the natural cold that was wanting to come in through Taiyang from heaven. So it becomes very obvious that this is just how things work. So looking at the channels of the body, you know, again, the sage faces south. And when we face south, the right yang is above. And chapter 10 of the Huangdi Ne Jingling Shu describes the flow of the channels as follows. That the flow of the channels is yang channels flow down and yin channels flow up. The Nanjing has it differently, that the arm channels are flowing down and the leg channels are flowing up, and we'll see what those differences might mean. But what I want to see for now is that these channels in our body, these 6 channels, are the guide ropes and connecting threads between heaven and earth. They are the Jing. They are these vertical lines between heaven and earth that bring in the chi from heaven in order to properly generate these cycles of growing up and maturing and growing back down that we see in all kinds of functions in our body, from the pulse to the breath to the menstruation, everything. These channels are the guide ropes and connecting threads. So in Ling Shu chapter 10, the yang channels go down and the yin channels go up. Right? But in Ling Shu chapter 2, there's this other flow, which is from the Jing well points getting stronger, going up to the Hesi points. So it seems like a bit of a contradiction, you know, that if the yang channel on the arm is going down, it follows that well, spring, stream, river, sea. However, from the toes going down, it goes in the opposite direction. You know, so the yang is going all the way down to the toe, according to Ling Shu chapter 10. But Ling Shu chapter 2 says, yeah, but on the leg, there's also this motion that's going back up again too. So I'm just going to offer kind of a solution to this seeming contradiction, like, what direction do the channels go? So Ling Shu chapter 2 has them like this, going from the extremities towards the center. So if we integrate these, we have yang channels going down together from the hands, going down, and from Ling Shu 10 going all the way down to the toes, and Ling Shu 2 has them turning and going back up. We have the yin channels going up together. 2 and 10 are coordinated. But then we have going back down. So for me, it gives this picture of yang coming in, turning, going back up again, and turning and coming back in. So we see this beautiful cycling when we look at the channels from this perspective. Just beautiful cycling that corresponds to what we're saying about the yang coming in, the great sweeping motions, turning, going back out, and pivoting again so it can come back in. And this constant motion of bringing the pre-heaven in to become the post-heaven so we can express ourselves back out into life. Okay, so next time we'll be finishing physiology. We're going to be talking about a really important concept called Biaoben Zhong, or branch, root, middle. We'll be talking about the central pivot, and we'll also talk about Kai He Shu, which is open, close, and pivot. Then we'll start talking about pathology and what happens when the great sweeping motions are not functioning properly, how they stop functioning, and what does it look like, and why does it look that way for each conformation. And I think you'll see that it's just very intuitive, makes a lot of sense. And we'll also be looking at the flavors of herbs and how the different flavors work with the conformations to help them function properly. Okay, thank you very much. And I will see you next time.